Hi everyone, my name is Dylan. I'm going to be giving this workshop today on art. Thanks for Martha and Rob for having me deliver this, and apologies that I wasn't able to do this live. I would have really enjoyed to do it live. I think it would have been great to have a discussion, but unfortunately I work evenings at the moment, so in terms of pure practicalities, it wasn't practical, I guess. The title that I've given to this workshop, Art Beyond Euphemism, um, is quite specific. The reason why I've chosen it this way is because I think in debates about art, both in BP and just in general conversation, um, art is discussed oftentimes quite euphemistically. People make reference to art's capacity to enthrall or change or uplift people. You'll oftentimes hear about people talking about art being transformative. You'll hear people talking about things like catharsis. And all of these descriptors are obviously useful and true in some instances, but particularly in a BP debate, if you want to think about art more critically, there are things that you need to not necessarily move beyond per se, but that you need to begin to unpack, that you need to begin to analyze, that you need to tease out. So, what does it mean for art to be cathartic, for example? What does it mean for art to be transformative? What does that what's the actual procedure there? What's the process? How can that be described in more specific terms? And that's the kind of overall effect that I want to elicit as a result of this workshop. I think the hope is that by the end, you'll be able to have some more specific descriptions and ideas of how to use art in debates, plus, of course, some kind of strategic tools to deploy as well, and some more familiarity with some art ideas. A few notes of housekeeping just up the top. The first thing is structurally, the workshop is just going to be pretty loose. There's two sections. The first section is the predominant section. It's the largest section. It's just talking about a bunch of different ideas in art that you might find useful in debate. I toyed about with different forms of structure. I think just going through a bunch of different ideas pretty quickly might be the best way to do it. I'm trying to target most of the things that could come up in debate or ways in which you can talk about art. I almost inexorably won't cover everything. The second section is a brief section that's more about just like on the ground in debates, in BP debates specifically, what are some kind of tips and tricks and tools that you can use, some ideas that you'll need to deal with in order to get your idea to work in a debate. Second thing that I want to note is just in terms of credentials, I am not someone who's exceptionally well versed academically in art, but it has been the focus of a lot of my study, most of my academic writing over the last couple of years, most of my work in my master's. But it's been through a very particular lens, and there's two specific lenses that it's been through. One is critical theory. Generally, that's more German critical theory as well. Adorno, Horkheimer, Benjamin, those kinds of guys. And that is going to almost certainly color the kind of content that you're going to be receiving here. So you're not going to see as much stuff because kind of more traditional in its way of perceiving art. But that's not to say that these ideas might not be useful, even if you disagree with them, because the manner through which you will disagree with them will reveal to you an insight about how you perceive art and how you understand art. But it might imply that some topics might not be covered as much as they would have otherwise, because there would be blind spots to me. The second thing is, although I am an artist, I've made music for years and years and years now, dabbled in a little bit of poetry and writing as well. That does mean, however, that I'm going to be less versed in some other forms of art. I read a little bit, but I'm not extremely into literature. I enjoy watching films, but I'm not an extreme like art house movie buff. I wouldn't be familiar with a lot of that stuff. Where I am more familiar with kind of more in-depth knowledge and more experimental work is in music. And so the idea is that for me, by analogy, they can be representative of ideas that I can then communicate and that you can pick up and apply to things to which you're more familiar. But it's something that might be worth considering when I'm going throughout this is like, if there is focus on thinking about things through the lens of music, and I've tried to diversify it, but it might not always be the case. You might want to think about whether the ideas that I'm espousing apply in the same way for different forms of art, for visual art or sculpture, for film, for literature, for dance, for things that I might not be thinking about when I was writing this per se. They might alter the kind of the timbre of your interpretation of the work. So with that being said, let's just roll right into it. The first thing, and the kind of, I think, a really critical idea to kind of get in your head when you're thinking about art, is that in much the same way that we wouldn't expect someone to learn sufficient information about economics through just watching some economics workshops for debating on YouTube, in much the same way that we wouldn't expect someone to know a sufficient amount of information about international relations through watching workshops on YouTube. You should similarly not expect to be fully equipped to discuss art in debates or in general just by watching some art workshops on YouTube, even though there are some that are very good. At the same time, I think that the majority of the arguments that I have made in art debates didn't find their genesis in a textbook or in an essay I read or in some university work or an art workshop. Mostly they came from experiences of consuming art, experiences of experiencing art, episodes of art experience from throughout my life, that struck me, that I found compelling, or that I found disgusting, or that I found elicited these strong emotions that I found therefore useful to deploy in debate. So what I would suggest is, and it's also just good because it's good to do in general, go visit a couple of different museums or galleries, go to some experimental music gig that you might not even really enjoy, go listen to a bunch of strange albums, go watch some unusual films, go make some art, go try write some poetry, try, if you have an instrument at home, try record a song, try make a painting, do a drawing. These things I think will teach you more about art and the art process than not necessarily more than any kind of academic or workshop work could, but I think in conjunction with those works, you get a strong response that you wouldn't have had otherwise, because you need to not just have the words to interpret art or to understand or discuss art, but the feelings and experiences to which those words relate, in order to generate, in my view at least, a strong understanding of art and the art process. And this is where I'll just make one final note about kind of housekeeping beforehand, which is I really, really wish that C18s would set motions about art more frequently, because, as hopefully will be evidenced throughout this workshop, but I think should just be intuitively true, art and the art experience governs so much of our life. For those of us that are very into art, more so than others, but even just in general, the amount of art that you perceive on a day-to-day basis is massive. Every song you listen to on the radio, or when you wake up in the morning and you put on your headphones when you're going to work, every advertisement you've ever seen, every billboard you've ever seen, every piece of graphic design on a shop front as you walk along the town, all of those things govern so much in terms of a percentage of your sense perception per day, that I think it's pivotal to understand it, to discuss about it frequently. And it's a shame that sometimes you can go 4 or 5 competitions in a row without necessarily getting a chance to discuss it. And the other reason there is kind of embedded, which is I just think it's intoxicating to talk about. I think it's really, really enjoyable to hear others talking about the art that they found special, that they found enjoyable. I think it's really fulfilling to discuss it for yourself as well. And so having that kind of attitude, I think, is so critical if you want to get better at discussing art in debates. I would say that, trying to have this attitude, trying to have, an attitude of, voracious consumption of art and of really trying to push your own boundaries is a good in itself, and that it's kind of a side benefit, that it's beneficial for debating. But it is a side benefit. So I guess if you are trying to, it's like the way hay fever allergy tablets are just like a really weak version of sleeping pills. I think they're both antihistamines. In the same way, it's like, okay, if you want to get better at discussing art, having this kind of this perspective on the world, being introspective, thinking about things when you are experiencing them is really, really valuable, I think. So that's the kind of first piece of general overview before we get into some of the more content oriented stuff. Okay, first thing I want to talk about is form. Form is actually going to be, I think, really critical in a lot of debates about art. So form basically just refers to what way is the artist communicating, or on what medium is the artist communicating their ideas, or what or in what way are they constructing the piece, right? So even though predominantly, like a lot of different paintings can look very, very different. Abstract expressionist piece will look very different from, like, I don't know, some traditional classic piece. But they both are oftentimes going to be painting on canvas, will be the name of that form. Similarly, a song by Billy Joel and a song by, I don't know, Elvis Presley might bear some similarities and differences in their composition, but both of them are going to be recorded to I guess maybe sometimes it could be vinyl or CD or whatever, but are received through, there might be headphones, and what might be a kind of form in that sense. Could be, you could go to a live concert of them, and you'll have a difference in your understanding of those kinds of things. The first thing I think that is really useful to think about in terms of art is, what is the difference between those experiences? What's the difference between going to a gig versus going to a theater? What's the difference between going to seeing a statue in a public place, and the kind of incidentality of that experience, the kind of immersion in a kind of an environment of people, versus going to a really cloistered small exhibition for, I don't know, dance or sculpture or something like that. What's the difference between going to the cinema to see a movie versus watching it at home? What's the difference between listening to music on headphones versus listening to it on a speaker at a party? I think intuitively, you should be full of thoughts here, because those are such radically different experiences. And interestingly, they're not even related to the content of the art itself per se. They're more just governing the medium through which the art, the form, I guess, through which the art is experienced. The reason why I think this can be useful in debates is twofold. One is, oftentimes motions about art pieces will, or art in general, I guess, will have a lurking conception of form within them. By which I mean, if a motion is, this house as a young musician would choose A over B, they would pursue traditional art versus experimental art. What might be really important that will be under discussed in the debate frequently, and might give you room for an extension, for example, is what the experience of live performance is going to be like for that musician, or how that genre that they're choosing to do, if it's genre A versus genre B, pertains to composition of music. And that can be, if you're thinking, like, I'm not somebody who likes to discuss art in very, abstract detail, I prefer more grounded cases. This can still be quite useful, because it could be, in order to perform a gig of this form, of this kind of, within the form of music, this genre, it would require 4 or 5 people and some expensive equipment. And so your sharings from the gig are going to be quite low. You'll never make it big, and it can be difficult to finance if you're someone that comes from a normal background. Whereas in genre B, there's more of a tradition of solo artists. The equipment necessary is less expensive, and you might be more likely to get a gig at your local pub than you would with the other genre. Those things are both going to be strongly related to the medium, because if it was visual art instead of painting, and say the two genres are like country music versus experimental music, right? You might be able to make the argument that country music is actually very easy in terms of the like entry level requirements, because you just need a guitar and a kind of all right voice. And a lot of the more interesting elements will come through the storytelling you have in your lyrics, through the kind of interesting choices you make in your guitar work, rather than experimental music where buying a modular synth is going to cost you a lot of money, and you might find it more difficult to get a gig at your local pub. That might not be as true for something like visual art, where if it's about painting expressionist pieces versus classic pieces, for example, it might be more easy to suggest that the raw materials, at the very least, are not meaningfully or significantly different at the entry level in terms of their cost to produce. So that will be an example of an extension in that debate, which is reliant on a conception of understanding form, not necessarily comparatively, but thinking within form. Similarly, you will have some debates that are about comparisons of form, that will discuss, different kinds of art expression, and that's something that's kind of important to think about as well. Similarly, I think the kind of critical thing, or a critical thing to think about here, if you're thinking about form, is how form enhances or alters the way in which the art is received to the consumer. A good example might be a book. A good book can be something that, unless you're a really, really voracious reader, can be something that is with you for a period of your life, whether that's a couple of months, whether that's a couple of weeks, whether you read it over a year. That could be something that is with you for that period, that alters your conception of that period, that you bring with you in your bag when you're going to class, that you read on the bus or on the tube on the way home. That is very different from, I don't know, like there's think of like a lot of individual artworks, right? Going to a live performance. That's a singular experience. You're going to that experience, and often, say in more I guess experimental work, or in more, even not even necessarily experimental work, it's then a lot of work that can be a really singular experience. That performance will not be the same every time it is performed. They might not go to your city again for 10 years. They might not have live recordings of it, or the live recordings would feel very different. So like it's very different to read a play versus to go to see it in the theater, I guess, is kind of what I'm trying to say here. And that really alters the way you think about it, and it can be for better or worse, right? Like the fact that people can listen to music on headphones very, very accessibly and very frequently, you could certainly argue that that means that the amount of passive listening increases, and I think that would be absolutely true. More people are going to be listening to music while doing something else than are going to be watching a play while doing something else, right? And that really changes how you should discuss those kinds of things. That really changes the nature of the art experience itself in ways that are useful to discuss when you're in debates about these things. For example, as a piece of framing, you can, if you're talking about theater, you can suggest it as being an almost uniquely focused piece of attention that you have on the artwork, where going on your phone is prohibited or frowned upon during it, where everyone around the person in the audience is looking at the thing at the same time. There's a really high amount of communal focus there. That might mean that you can maybe work on some more interesting stuff than you would have otherwise. But maybe it goes the other way around. Maybe the fact that it's a public experience of consumption means that people feel pressured into certain kinds of interpretation or understanding of the work in a way that they wouldn't for a private act of consumption, like having headphones on. Maybe making music that in a digital streaming era is more open, is more available in terms of what you can talk about, what you can discuss, how you can make sounds, because each individual person is receiving it oftentimes in a private or quasi-private environment. That might make them more open to things that might go against what they perceive, at least, as being the kind of understanding of the mob, of the people that are around them in the audience. So that's, I think, a really useful starting point to think about art, because you're almost always, or at least very frequently, going to be able to talk about form, what differentiates this form of art versus another one, either as a way of defending that form versus another one, or as a manner of framing the arguments that you're going to be providing within a particular form that everyone is discussing. So that's the first thing I wanted to kind of talk about a little bit. Next thing is about aura. This comes, I'm going to talk about this a little bit again later. This comes from an essay from Walter Benjamin. But a natural follow-on of this, and I kind of talked about it a little bit here, is like thinking about how you experience art differently in each environment. And this is the same artwork received in a number of ways. So I think that a painting has in a gallery is really physical existence, especially if you don't have like a glass thing in front of it, which not all paintings do. There's a physical object in front of you, and it feels like a real object, or maybe a little bit less than real, but it certainly doesn't feel virtual. And that kind of texture is something that is lost even on very high quality renderings or scans of that artwork available online, and that can really change how you understand an artwork, and that relates to a concept that Benjamin calls aura. I don't know if he got it from somewhere else or whether it's the first time in that essay that he talks about it. But what he suggests is that historically, an artwork would have an original copy that has a certain power to it as a consequence of its originality, right? And that's, I think, pretty intuitive, because if you saw a painting in a gallery as a real painting in real life versus seeing a replica of it in somebody's home, I think it's not an intrinsic maybe element of the artwork, but I think it's really very intuitive that those are different experiences at the very least. That there's a certain power of authenticity, of authorship that the original has that a replica may not have. What he suggests is that in a lot of more modern artworks, no particular original as such can be ascertained. That aura is decentralized, or is dissolute, or is non-existent in a kind of more modern medium, which is to say, like, maybe abstractly, like the master tracks for a particular top 40 song exists on someone's computer somewhere, but it doesn't really necessarily seem that my experience listening to it on a headphones versus someone else's experience listening to it on headphones are distinct along lines of aura or along lines of authenticity, because the product as such has always been a replica. There is perhaps no such original. But and some of the kind of questions that I have as a consequence of this that are worth thinking about is, is there something lost when when an original as such doesn't really exist anymore? So we would say yes, that there is a kind of a moment of that singular experience of authorship that can be really compelling, because maybe it feels like there's a more direct link between you and the artist. It feels more real, maybe in a way. And I think the reality of an artwork is a really interesting thing to tease out when you're thinking about it. But what a lot of people would suggest otherwise is that it actually is a horizon of possibilities, because it means that it's almost democratic in a way, that aura is dispersed or non-existent, that there's no version of the art that has authority over another version of the art, that each individual experience of it is equally therefore authentic and valid, valuable to people experiencing it. Second thing then is it's worth thinking about the other ways in which art is mediated. And when we say mediation, what we mean is what are the filters that something passes through on its way to an audience, or on its way to a recipient or a reader or a listener or whatever. And one thing that you might think about is the kind of tempered glass or whatever that exists between a painting and an audience member in a gallery is a kind of mediation, in the same way that taking a picture of that painting and putting it online and having that go through a screen towards you, and the color grading of your laptop or your phone, those two things are both perhaps mediated experiences, therefore. And so what's more useful to think about is the difference in the ways in which that mediation happens. And that's something that can be really useful to bring into debates. If you are ever talking about the environments in which art is consumed, which is pretty frequent. If we follow this on from thinking about some of the stuff we're talking about in terms of form, you might want to think about, there's two kind of avenues of thinking you can have here. One is that the mediation that is not intrinsic to a particular form, but is comorbid with it, which is to say, some of the stuff I was talking about earlier, passive listening in the context of music is something that is really, really important to think about. But that's not necessarily something that has to be a bad thing, because it might mean that it is not just mediated through your headphones to you, but through the environment through which you're walking, right? The fact that it can be experienced at home in a way that's really immersive can maybe be really valuable, right? So for example, if somebody's talking about their life experiences in their artwork, say it's very open, exoteric artwork that's, this is what I lived through, it was terrible, and now I'm doing better. If their life is different from yours, but bears similarities, something like music listening can be a very interesting way for people to relate to that artwork and to find what represents them, to be more even open to the artist's experiences if they weren't previously, because they might see that, if someone is talking about dilapidated buildings in a different country, in a different environment, in a different setting, but you're listening to it on your headphones while you're going through, an environment of decay, whether that's urban or rural, that's the kind of experience that can kind of build connections between a listener and an artwork that is really, really different from going to see a play that's about the same thing. And that's something I think that you really want to be thinking about, is that kind of immersion in an artwork, and those kinds of levels of kind of I guess thinking about these kinds of things. The second thing I believe that I was going to say to be thinking about in terms of how this relates to form is just the intrinsic nature of different kinds of form, right? Some forms will retain a stronger aura if you buy the argument that there is an original copy that has a certain kind of experience to it that's different from a replica. If you buy that, then some forms of art will be more that will be germane to some forms of art more than others, because for the most part your experience of seeing a sculpture will be of the original of that sculpture, whereas for the most part, if you read a pamphlet, it will not be or that original will not exist. Similarly for a book or a work of literature in general. And so that is an interesting space to explore in your arguments if you're ever talking about a particular kind of art form or art media. Okay. I think I wrote this down as exercise one. I'm not sure if there is more than one exercise, but I think it's a very useful thing to do. So one of the best albums of all time is Love Supreme. I really recommend listening either back to back or across a different period of time to the album version of this and the live in Seattle version of a part 2 of A Love Supreme, which is my favorite part of it. And I want you to think about how they feel to listen to. And, you can take for yourself a difference that you feel from it. And you might, write down a couple of things if you can. What's the difference in how these two things make you feel? The album version, to me, obviously it's clearer, it's cleaner, and so it's easier to parse out certain things you might not have gotten otherwise. I guess both of these, like the album version is a live version as well, right? It's not like it's it's not made in a computer, but the live version feels really spatial. There's a real direction to where the instruments are coming from. That really kind of, if you close your eyes, you can feel there's almost a vicarious audience nature to it. Like you feel like you are listening to it live, even though you know that you're not. And there's different values that can be derived from those two things, and it's, I think, important at this stage at least to not be thinking, well, one of these things is better than the other, or even I would even suggest that it's not even worth thinking about the ways in which each one is better than the other. At this stage, you should be just thinking about, in my opinion, the differences in the experience. This one feels like X, this one feels like Y. This one has property A, whereas this one has property B, because that's going to really activate your brain to be starting to think comparatively about art that bears strong similarities with itself. So these are two pieces of art which are obviously very, very similar. They're the same song, but in two different environments. But I think what I'm trying to, I guess, evoke or elicit here is not just to get you to start thinking comparatively about these things, but to understand as well that there is a radical difference between these two things. There is an extreme difference in the sensations that you feel as a result of it, and that's a really big space to explore when discussing art, when discussing art in debates. Okay, next thing is to think about genre. So you can think of genre similarly to form, right? So in the same way that artists within a particular form might test the boundaries of that form, artworks and artists can glide between genres or work in different genres at once. It's worth being vaguely familiar with the key genres within different kinds of art, just because that might be the subject of a debate and you might want to be familiar with it a little bit. It's also interesting to think about genre as such, to think about genre in its own right, and the ways in which that can be good or bad. This is just a brief example I have here, and there's a really good band that I really, really like, but they're always really referred to as jazz or hip hop artists in their work, even though their work covers a variety of genres. And I don't think it's crazy to suggest that the reason why music media writes about them as jazz and hip hop artists is because they're Black, and because they are from New York, and I think that, and maybe they would be fine with that descriptor. Maybe they would understand that there is some similarities, I guess, between the work of jazz, work of hip hop, and the work that they make. But it is worth thinking, even just beyond this one example, of the ways in which genre can be deployed as a political tool, the way it can be deployed as a tool that changes how people understand artwork they're experiencing, the ways in which it can be confining to people. Because whereas it's easy to consider that, or to imagine that genre is something that an artist chooses, that comes from their what they feel represents them in their artwork, the sounds they enjoy, the styles they enjoy, the ways in which they like to express themselves. It's not just a moment of association that's liberatory on behalf of the artist, but it's a dialectic, it's a process between the artist and the art world, meaning the audience, the writers, etc., to categorize them and to put them into a particular box. Similarly, I was going to say here, you might want to think about how often the term feminist art or queer art is used to describe art that's just made by women or made by queer people, even if it isn't, per se, of that genre, or if that's a genre that really meaningfully exists as such. It perhaps does, and those terms can be useful sometimes. But I think what I want to kind of suggest here is that these things can be used derisively and pejoratively. And I suggest here that you should look into the history of degenerate art, right? And of how, the Nazis in Germany in the 1930s categorized a lot of art that was made by people as degenerate art, undermined it, sidelined it, marginalized it, and the people who created it indeed, and how that, not in its precisely the same form, but that process of labeling an artwork so as to undermine it, so as to delegitimize it, or to suggest that it's lower or inferior, is something that is not a relic of history, but is something that does continue forward to the present. And I think that can happen in pretty benign or small ways, right? The ways in which people talk about pop music, for example, I think can be undermining a little bit. I think it wouldn't be unfair to suggest that there's quite a little bit of misogyny in the way that some people talk about pop music, and derisively, pejoratively, undermining particularly female artists within those spaces. But it can happen in more serious ways as well, and it's something that is not to suggest that that's not serious, of course, but in more grave ways, I guess I should say, and something to be considering as well. However, sorry, I'm not going to go however yet. The however is the next slide, or the second of this slide. So yeah, genre is the method of categorizing art, but also, and this is really crucial, categorizing art isn't an abstract label. It's not just the tag that happens in the bottom of it's not just where you put it in the CD store. But it also changes how that art is interpreted, consumed, politicized, performed, etc. I think even the example I just gave there as being a kind of a minor example where that art is put in the CD store, that really would change a lot of things, or in the modern context, right? Like if you're streaming a playlist of a genre, which playlist is it in? Because there's two ways, I guess, that this really alters the way in which that genre relates to the artist. One is, to what art community does that art therefore become home? When someone makes a choice, a particular artistic choice within a particular medium, that choice is understood not just as a singular moment of relation with the art, but is understood comparatively with relation to the art that is seen of being of the same ilk. So if you watch, for example, a sci-fi movie that chooses to have magic as an element of its plot, that will be kind of unusual. Normally, magic and technology can function in similar roles. So that would be an interesting choice. That's very different from having magic as an element of a plot in a biography or in an autobiography. A great example actually would be the new Robbie Williams movie. Him being depicted as an ape in that movie and the use of CGI for that is a very different choice in a biography than it would be as a work of fiction, or pure fiction, I should say. Similarly, if an indie artist uses like really trap inspired hi-hats across their art, that's very different to using trap hi-hats in trap music. If you choose to have a really like house style bass line in a country song, that would be very different from having it in even a pop song. And it means that the focus of the piece to the listener is redirected as a consequence of what they're listening to around it and what their priors were before they listened to it or before they experienced it. So similarly, there was a lot of invective thrown around and a lot of debate and really horrible things said about Beyonce's most recent album, which was a country album. And it's I think intuitive to see how a Black woman making a country artist might find hostility in that space, might find difficulty in that space, might struggle to find that space to be receptive or accepting. At least not obviously entirely, but for portions of it, that was a really politically motivating force for hatred and exclusion. So, but at the same time, it's also worth thinking about why she would want to make a country album anyways. Similarly, Chappell Roan released a country song recently, and she was quite open about her motivations for doing that, because there was the music that she grew up with and listened to, even though the art that she generally chose to make was a little bit outside of what was on the radio when she was growing up. A choice to return to it and to go back with it is a really interesting choice. But at the same time, genre can be really valuable, and it's, I think, even though I think people are generally kind of against genreification or labeling of art, or at least that's something that gets thrown around as a concept pretty frequently, it is really worth noting how that can be valuable for people as well. So both on behalf of artists to understand themselves, how to perform, but also if they know their artwork is in a certain genre, or if it's a genre that they really enjoy, being able to find communities of people around them that are into that same art and artwork, being able to find venues who do gigs for people who make that style of art, being able to, or even, in non-music terms, like, where do I submit my work for publication more broadly? How do I ask the questions I want to ask in order for me to improve at my work and to improve at my in my chosen medium? All those things can be easier when you have the language of genre to express it, to verbalize it, to understand it. Similarly, as I said, for audiences, it's easy to kind of look down on genre, but at the same time, if you are 33 years of age and you just heard you just read a book of magical realism for the first time, and you thought it was absolutely incredible, you really, really enjoyed it, you found it really motivating, you found the style to be fascinating, you found it affected you, but you hadn't heard of it before and you didn't know what genre it was. Being able to Google what genre is this book, and then more books like this in this genre, Googling like top 10 magical realism books, reddit.com, that could be stuff that could be really, really valuable for people. That might make the ease of access to those spaces become increased, to become enhanced. And so it is worth thinking about genre as I said here, a push and pull, an equilibrium, not necessarily an equilibrium, but something around which people are continuously fighting, but also a space that can be in some senses valuable as well. The reason why I suggest this as being important for debate is because, similarly to form, this is some stuff that is outside of the content of the artwork that interacts with the way in which that artwork is deployed and understood and interpreted by people and by artists. I think at the same time, it also becomes the subject of debate as well, and thinking about how these spaces operate, thinking about how this changes how your art is understood and decoded is really important. Because if it's an artist with a particular motivation choosing a genre, which is a pretty common subject of debate, thinking about the way that genre historically and presently is understood by society, the tools they have to decode it is really useful. I think a good example of this is political art. Is the argument around political art through popular genre is something that has been going on for years and years and years and years and years. And I think a strong argument you could make through this lens is that because, say, popular music is something that is often engaged with very frequently, but at low levels of engagement sometimes, and the political message might become obscured. Or similarly, you might say that the ways in which people have been taught to understand political messages in, say, hip hop are different from how they were taught to understand political messages in poetry, like written word poetry. And I think there's a lot of interesting ideas you can tease out there about why those genres came to be the way they were, how people engage with art on the level of genre, how it gives them the tools to understand art in ways that can be both beneficial or harmful. That, I think, is the kind of area that could be really, really useful in debating about art. It can be the basis of an extension pretty frequently, similarly to how we discussed form previously, because it's often genre is something that will oftentimes be something that is either the subject of the debate, or it will be a lurking idea in the debate, because it will be presumed or given to you by the motion that between teams you're discussing a particular genre, but the specificities of that genre and how they relate to the artwork itself might be underexplored, and that can give you a lot of space to maneuver, to navigate, and to ideate in a debate. Okay. Next thing is about interpretation. This is where we're moving on towards more the artwork itself. There's an essay called Against Interpretation, where Susan Sontag argues that over focusing on interpretation of texts is oftentimes going to be bad. It's not good. And the reason is because she suggests that we eventually trip ourselves up over kind of decoding and trying to parse out different bits of information, trying to unpeel this esoteric reading of the text, trying to find an interpretation of it that makes sense, in a very literal way. That language and that process ends up eclipsing another valuable and what she feels more valuable part of the art experience, which is just, how does this piece make you feel? What does the experience of this piece feel like? And what she argues is that we need to develop a language that allows us to discuss art in stronger terms of the affect of sensation rather than interpretation and literalism, or not literalism, but like you know what I mean. Uncovering the within things. Now, I think this is something that I find pretty compelling, at least in certain ways. And the artwork that I have on the side here for this slide is a painting called Blue by Yves Klein, which I think is, to me, the strongest example of this. There's a couple of versions of these paintings. There's one in the Tate in London, in the Tate Modern, and I went and saw it, and I thought, this painting is great. It's so blue, and when you see it in real life, you're like, man, this painting is really, really blue. And I spent a long time looking at it, but I didn't feel the need to interpret it through the lens of like, oh, the artist using this choice of blue represents this, and in the context of their life, it means this thing here and this thing here. I was just in awe at how blue it was. And that, I think, is an experience that's worth considering for an artwork, because it's a little bit against the lines of how people talk about art, but I think is really true sometimes. However, what I will say though is that I think there's a pretty common, popular understanding of art that says, oh well, in English class or in literature class in general, you're taught that oh, when the artist says that the curtains were blue, that represents the sadness of their inner world and their feeling of hopelessness resulting through the previous elements of the plot and how that resolves back to the present, yada yada yada. But in reality, what the author just meant is the curtains were blue. I think this is pretty generally false. I think if you talk to artists or listen to interviews with artists, there actually oftentimes is a huge amount of intentionality and care put into very specific choices. Even in, it doesn't mean that they necessarily need to mull over them for huge amounts of time, but just that there is a motivation and a consideration for a lot of the different choices, even pretty minor choices present within artworks. And all those choices form the mosaic of the experience of the audience when they are experiencing it. So I think when, like, whether or not the curtains per se literally represent a sadness of the protagonist, for example, that doesn't undermine whether or not, when your visual picture of the text is of this room that is dark and gray and blue, that does prime you for sensations of sadness or for melancholy. And so that, just because there's a depth to the intentional creation of the space, because there is that depth, that means that the sensation or the feeling that the text evokes can be a complex one. It can be a multifaceted emotion, and that's oftentimes the space that art really likes to pick away at, is those difficult to understand emotions, difficult to depict emotions, because that's why you write 10,000, 50,000 words about a story, is so that you can get at a particular emotion or an idea more strongly. So that's something that I guess is an open idea. And I think one thing that is worth thinking about at the same time as this is that even though I think it's I would imagine intuitive, the view that I've just espoused there, right? That the sensations and the feelings of the artwork are the prime response that people have to the artwork, the primary response, I should say, to the artwork. It is worth thinking about how intentional readings and how readings against a text, or how interpretive readings can be, valuable as well. I think what is important to get at there is two things if you want to make such an argument. One is, does the feelings of that artwork combined with an interpretation that is maybe drawing that feeling away from its original home within the artwork towards a new space, is that new interpretation, or is that esoteric interpretation something which will motivate either a new sensation within people who experience it, or a new action of the people who experience it, that would be therefore beneficial afterwards? So I think it's very easy to suggest that, like, perhaps it is the case that when somebody does a queer reading of Bram Stoker's Dracula or of Frankenstein, that they are moving a little bit away from, the text itself, but they are opening up a new space for them to either express an idea that might be to them politically valuable and might achieve some sort of political effect, or that they achieve a certain kind of value in it. And we'll get a little bit on later into the kinds of feelings and sensations that could be. But that's where you want to be thinking. Another thing you want to be thinking about here in terms of interpretation, and this is going to be very, very important because a lot of debates are going to be about interpretation, is what truth value do you attach to your interpretation, and how important is that truth value in interpretation? So if I say that, if someone were to do a reading of, I'll give you an example I quite like. So the one of the like Irish myths is Anton. It's a book as well, and it's predominantly about Cuchulainn. I read once someone uploaded, I think like when I was like 17, I read someone who uploaded their dissertation on Tumblr, which was a queer reading of Cuchulainn. And something that they were really open about in the text itself, and that I understood when I was reading it, is that they don't think it was like literally true. Like they were interpreting it, the text, but they didn't think that they were drawing out a hidden meaning of the text itself, but rather generating a new meaning. And that's something that's really interesting, right? Because often if you watch like YouTube videos or like top 50 secrets you didn't know in Phineas and Ferb, they're expressed in language that suggests that what they're saying is true, as though they're doing an act of science. But a lot of acts of interpretation are almost like iterative art, in the sense that they create a new piece of art, at least in the subjectivity of the viewer, that didn't exist previously. And that's something that's really interesting to think about, is how truthful do you think that your reading needs to be? How authentic and how authoritative does that reading need to be? And how does that change how you discuss the text? How does that change how you interpret the text? And how does that change about how you feel about the text? Next thing though is, I guess, another kind of counterexample, or at least a partial counterexample, to Sontag here, is contextual interpretation. So you might often believe that descriptive information about the history of the piece or of the author can be beneficial, can be useful in some ways. I think this is pretty intuitive, right? Like most museums will have like a plaque beside an artwork that tells you a little bit about the piece and the author. And It's potentially true that some artworks don't need that, or maybe would even be enhanced by not having it, but it is a general preference that I would say we tend to have. I talk here, and it's the image in the background, about I saw the TV Globe, a movie I really, really enjoyed recently. There's a central metaphor in the text, right? That's a movie about being trans, and it's not text in the movie, except for maybe some very small portions, but the movie is generally not about that. But at the same time, like, it would be kind of inextricable from the experience of watching the film to think about it as not being a trans film. And there's so much really, really transparent visual imagery and metaphor that it's really clear that the author's intention is that the audience's interpretation be along these lines. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit later about why you would make that choice. Why would you describe something in metaphorical terms, in a way that's not just to hide what you're talking about, but to explore what you're talking about in either a greater level of detail or through a different lens, in a different light. But I think that it's a good example, because just talking about how that made you feel, if you somehow missed that was the central metaphor of the piece, at least very intuitively feels like an impoverished experience of the artwork, that you're missing something in the same way that you would be missing something if you missed the first 30 minutes of a movie. That is a core element of the experience. And so you might want to start thinking about how we can blend interpretation and the kind of very literal interpretations with kind of more affective or sensational stuff, by which I mean developing that language around, like, well, what does this part of if the central metaphor is this, what does this individual moment come to represent, and how does that feel as a viewer to experience? And I think this is, again, a space in which this is a movie where after I watched it, the more and more I thought about it, the more and more I enjoyed it. The more I talked about it, the more I enjoyed it. I think it's a really good example where not the text, but I can't remember the word for it. Text that isn't the text. So the experience of the movie that is everything outside of experiencing the movie directly is still a part of what that artwork is. So the discursive space in which that movie permeates and continues to exist after the individual moment of experiencing it is somewhere in which it generates a lot of value from interpretation and from unpeeling and unpacking. And that's something it's really key to the experience. Similarly, things that have undergone a transformation in their history, in their provenance, are really valuable to talk about here as well. So an example I gave here is a painting called Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue. I think pretty widely discussed now because there was a video essay about it, or at least I featured it. That's a painting that was destroyed, or at least it was really damaged. And the way in which it was damaged is someone took a knife to it because they didn't like the kind of piece that it was. They hated it. And that's now been repaired, as far as I know, as well. Now, just to see that piece after its reparation, without the knowledge of the history of that piece, maybe that would be something that would really undermine your understanding of the piece. The context to interpret the piece. It just changes the experience of it. And it's very literal, real terms here. It's like, do you walk into the gallery and you see a big painting that has these interesting colors on it that makes you feel a certain way? Or do you walk into the gallery and you see this painting with interesting colors on it that make you feel a certain way, and then you read the blurb beside it that says this was a painting that was destroyed and then it was put back together again, and that then changes you take two roads depending on whether that blurb is there or not. One road is continuing to sit on the emotions that painting made you feel, just based off of the value of the painting itself, how well that art was depicted. Second road is you stop thinking about that as much and you start thinking about why somebody would choose to destroy this painting, what it means to repair a painting, whether they did a good job, etc. those things are contrastive. Those are juxtapositions. They're different ideas that you can choose to explore as a piece, as a part of the audience. And the way in which that artwork is presented to you, but also the tools you've been taught by society to use to decode art, to understand it, to interpret it, are going to differ, are going to change the experience of the artwork itself. If you have generally gotten an idea because you've been watching loads of, I don't know, cinema sins, and you've been watching, YouTube essays about hidden meanings in shows, you're going to be someone who thinks that art is about interpretation and wants to interpret and unpeel art. And that can be either harmful or good. Similarly, if you're somebody who is very open to feeling and experience in itself, in its own right, you're going to be thinking about art in those terms. And that's something that is really, 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 really important to think about in art. The reason why I say that, and the reason why I'm talking so much about interpretation here, is because a lot of art debates are going to be about either the ways in which audiences engage in art in general, or they're going to be about the ways in which artwork is expressed. And often that's the terms of that debate are going to be easily interpretable art versus openly interpretable art. So whether there's an open area in which people can explore their interpretations of the text and how they relate to it, or whether they're tightly compacted into a specific understanding of the experience of the artwork. And hopefully this has given you the tools to talk about those things and to generate your own ideas for where one can be better than the other, or the benefits and harms derived from each portion of it, even if you want where a balance can be struck between them and how that balance ought to be struck. Similarly, just a final line here. This is based off an essay by Sedgwick. She argues that we oftentimes want to what she calls paranoid reading. We peel through a text trying to find what everything that's wrong with it, everything that's harmful with it, and everything that's each discrete instance of wrongdoing or poor perspective on behalf of the author, in order to generate a critique of it that is more perfect. And she distinguishes this between reparative reading, which is reading openly, and reading in a way which engages in kind of better faith with the author. This is slightly different from what we've talked about just before. Obviously it overlaps, but I think one thing that's useful to think about here is like, well, in what faith do we address an artwork? And again, I think it's very, because of the phrasing of this and where I'm drawing the idea from, it's very easy here to get into the idea that one is just better than the other, that it's just better to be operating in good faith when you're engaging with an artwork, to be less critical, etc. But I think there's intuitive, I guess, instances where that would be societally or individually harmful towards you, right? If the text is something which exists against you, for example, that is something that is, derisive or undermining of either a group you belong to or a characteristic you exhibit, there might be a kind of strength in disagreeing with the artwork, saying, I just don't think that's true. I don't think that depiction was fair or reasonable, because and that probably would generate a form of anger. I'm not sure if the sensation that would be experienced there is feels positive, but I do think that it might be better than the alternative. At least intuitively, it seems better than the alternative, right? It's why we think people should be opposed to propaganda. It's why, really viscerally hateful artwork, we think it is good to perceive it as wrong, to not try and draw out what is beneficial or good about it. And I think what's kind of interesting to think about here, again, thinking in terms of the language of propaganda, is the benefit of a paranoid reading can be, in some senses at least, or in its best possible instances, understanding more about the author and the position that they hold. Not just what beliefs are they espousing, but how have they come to believe those beliefs? How have they formulated a worldview that allows them to express those ideas? And thinking of even teasing out things like contradictions in those worldviews, rather than necessarily just being used to point towards the wrongness of the author, can enhance your understanding of the world. And Similarly, for a reparative reading in those contexts, you can understand how often it's going to be false, which is to say, a good example of this is there's kind of pretty historical tradition of saying that the work of Leni Riefenstahl was really groundbreaking. And the reality is that's actually not true. All the techniques that she used were commonly in usage prior to her using them. The difference was just the scale and the funding she had behind her. And you can think about how a reparative reading of a truly objectionable artwork is running coverage for that artwork, is obscuring the real political, moral, or aesthetic necessity of fighting against that artwork, of negating it, of seeing it as wrong, or even the desire to supplant it with something better, to motivate for a change artistically or politically as a consequence of it. So that's something that's worth teasing out a little bit as well when you're thinking about those kinds of things in debates, right? Like, how do we come to interpret a piece of art in instances when those artworks are negative as well? One small thing I'll just hop on for a second here, because it's relevant here in a way that's really useful to think about, I think, in a lot of art debates, which is that often when we're talking about art, we don't solely want to discuss art in terms of sorry, one moment. Yeah. In terms of like utilitarian terms. Generally, I would say the marker in like, this is like in common discourse, everyone will agree with this if you talk to them about it. The marker of a good piece of art isn't like how happy were you during and after experiencing that artwork. Like, that's so obviously true. People don't just think, or generally don't just think, that the best art is the art that makes me feel happiest. Often it will be either one, did I learn something new about myself or the world that I did not know prior to this artwork, or that this artwork has enhanced within me, that I've been able to draw out more than I did previously. And what's lurking there is an idea that the good life is the considered life, the understood life, the inquisitive life, and the life which seeks out more information and understanding of themselves and the world that they inhabit. And that's really, 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 really intuitively true. Almost everybody will agree with you. Like, average people, normal people on the street, your friends, your family, etc., will agree with you when you say this. It's underused, I think, as a tool in debates. And I think art debates, as well as education debates, but particularly art debates, are an instance where you can really strongly make that argument, because the judge will be primed to receive it. They will understand that because the language that you'll be able to use, the tools and ideas and intuitions you'll be able to deploy, will be very readily available to you at that point of making the argument in the debate. Second thing that people find valuable in art outside of just learning is an intensity of emotion and experience. So I think that, I think this is a little bit less intuitive, I think, at least on first blush, but I think it's something you can definitely work with a little bit, is like, how much legitimacy does an artwork need to give in order for it making you cry and feel intense emotions of sadness to be a good thing rather than a bad thing? I think it's probably true that the cheapest techniques or tools of achieving that effect in an audience are not beneficial or not good. Having just putting a dog in the first two scenes and then shooting that dog in the third scene, whatever. That's an intensity of emotion that probably doesn't have a strong artistic motivation behind it. That therefore probably you wouldn't think is that valuable. But I think, to be honest, very low levels of artistic legitimacy, of narrative necessity, tend to be required in order for intense emotions to be valid and valuable in art. If you watch, I think it would be relatively like agreeable to say that if you watch like a rom-com and you find yourself crying a little bit at the ending of that rom-com because you're happy that the two people got together because they're destined for each other. That's, I think, really, really good. Like, it's a really, really strong experience. It breaks up the monotony of life otherwise. And I think that the two things you want to explore there, if you're thinking about taking that lens of why art is valuable in a debate, is one, when does that affect a strong negative or positive emotion become legitimate? Or what does it require in order for it to be legitimate? When does it become cheap, tacky artwork? When is it valuable? Because I don't think it requires a huge amount of complexity or motivation in order to be legitimate. So that's a really interesting question to think about. I don't have a strong answer at the moment, and so it's a really, I think that'd be a fascinating thing to hear a team discuss. The second thing you want to be thinking about along those lines is, why would we value intensity of experience in itself over and above the caliber of that experience or the nature of that experience? Why is it that I think we would broadly agree that it is more good for you and more good in general to watch a sad but a harrowing but valuable movie than it would be to watch, like, I don't know, Shark Tale, and I think that it represents something that is, I think, a shared intuition that we have, but I don't think often verbalized, which is that just feeling that range of human experience is a good thing in itself, right? It's because what people would say is that it's a very human thing to do, and that's a really interesting idea to tease out if you want to make an argument about that in a debate. I think it could be bolstered and emboldened by the fact that you often, I think, those experiences, when they exist outside of artwork, are rare for some people. At least for me, I don't find myself in like extremely strong, intense emotional states frequently in life relative to how frequently art evokes those states when I consume it. So that's maybe one lens you could explore there. The second lens you could explore there along those same terms is the nature of the kind of emotion that you feel. Does dread feel different when it comes through reading a book than it does when it comes in real life? Does sadness and pain feel different when it comes from a song versus coming from a conversation? There is some interesting things you can parse out there. Perhaps there's the fact that we know it to be in some senses false, at least a lot of the time, makes it easier to engage with and grapple with those emotions in ways we wouldn't do otherwise. Maybe it even makes us feel kind of grateful in some sense for the life that we have. We can be in two minds, right? There's the part of us that is empathetic and engaging with the artwork and cries the tears of the protagonist in our own eyes, but at the same time there's the part of us that understands that there but for the grace of God go I, how lucky I am, and you can be overcome by that kind of emotion simultaneously. But that's not true for all artwork, of course, because in a lot of art it's narratively true. A documentary film will be about something that's true. An autobiographical work or work that's based on the reality of people's lives, that those emotions are still real, as insofar as they are experienced by the person that is depicting them, or by the person that's being depicted. And so that might not be a strong enough force for you to explain why that intense emotion is so valuable to you. You might need to rely on some other tools. Maybe art is the medium through which we are able to communicate those emotions in ways that can be interpreted, in ways that can be understood, that can be parsed out, categorized, or maybe not even categorized, but tempered in a way that they can't in real life, and maybe that's where we derive a lot of the value from it. And this is where I want to say that, this is where we're trying to get beyond a euphemistic understanding, because that emotion that I've just described there is one of the emotions that people will lump in under the term catharsis. Um, um, an emotion that you experience being relayed to you in different terms such that you can understand it in ways you didn't previously, or not even understand it, but experience it, feel it in ways you didn't previously, has a value to it. And I think that that's why it's really worth parsing out what that experience, what that emotional state is, because otherwise you'll end up in really vague terms to describe it. But yeah, along those same lines, I think this is maybe an example where this element of readings, right? The intensity of emotions, this second way in which you can say that art is valuable outside of just it feeling good to do. That intensity of emotions is something that can be expressed if you want in utilitarian terms, because there's a kind of if you want catharsis experienced that is either you could say just intense in a way that a lot of other experiences aren't, and so on a trade-up of utility it accounts for a huge amount, or you can categorize utile experiences into, and even some utilitarians will do this, into like higher order kinds of experience. And this is where we'll discuss this a little bit later with jouissance and pleasure when we talk about Roland Barthes. There's kinds of positive emotions that seem worth more in value than just kind of incidental joy. So what you can say is that it's not just pleasure and pain and you want one to be higher than the other. There's this other category of emotion, maybe on both sides of that spectrum, that are the real things to be considering in life. So that's something that you might want to be thinking about as well. The third category through which you can arbitrate the value of art outside of utilitarian terms is truth and communication, is what I would say. So I think coming to believe things that are true and understanding truth, understanding more about the world insofar as that yields truth, is something that we do intuitively find to be quite valuable. And so it might be worth thinking about that in those terms. But alongside that, I think we find that there's an intrinsic value to the communication of ourselves to others and to others towards ourselves. It's not just that the considered life is the better life, but the communicated life, the shared life is valuable. We think that there is just, keeping secrets is a wrong in itself, that if you go through your life without communicating it to others, it's not just that you'll be sad or bitter, but that there's something somehow lost if you die without ever sharing what it meant for you to live. If you die without ever having understood what it meant to be in another person's shoes, if you died without ever coming to understand your fellow humans as fellow humans, and the kind of plethora, the mosaic of experience that exists out there. So those are three ways in which you can argue for the value of your artwork that are intuitive, compelling, and non-utilitarian. And that can be quite useful to think about sometimes. I will probably return to that a little bit more later. Okay. Symbolism and metaphor. So counterintuitively, or to some counterintuitively, symbolism and metaphor can make a text extraordinarily efficient. They can allow one thing to take on a variety of meanings and connotations. We all have our filter when we're going about the world. Different things will feel different to different people because they have different associations in their lives, right? If my father was a blacksmith, a hammer takes on a very different piece of symbolism to me than it might to somebody else. Or it might have the same feeling, but it might be evoked in kind of a different way. It might be something that I would pay attention to more than somebody else would. And these are oftentimes individual or cultural and shared. So as for example was suggested here, when a film uses Christ imagery, right? It's very, very, very common symbol to use in films. We don't just, it's not that we see the person and we go, oh, that's Christ imagery. And therefore we like understand it in those terms. It's because we have been so plugged in with these kinds of symbols throughout our life that the feeling that evokes goes straight to you. So again, this is, we want to be thinking here in terms of feelings and sensations. It produces a kind of feeling that a different symbol wouldn't in that same place because of a shared understanding or an individual understanding of what that symbol tends to mean. And one thing I'll note here as well, by the way, is that a symbol can take on a variety of different meanings, because something like even that Christ imagery, that has the association of religiosity, has the association of pain and suffering and torture. It has the association of sacrifice and sacrifice for a greater good. It has an association of tyranny and of oppression and of cruelty. And that is a really powerful symbol. Like that's, like if you're using that symbol, you're carrying a really large bucket of water. And one thing that is worth thinking about is what drops are spilled here and there when those terms are being used, when those ideas and symbols are being deployed in artwork beyond the intention of the artist themselves. And this one I'm going to talk about here a little bit, because it can alter the level of precision of an artwork in both in positive and negative, which is to say, because a symbol can come to mean a variety of different things, that symbol itself can become ambiguous. And the example I have here is from Pink Floyd's The Wall, where the symbol of hammers in that film being used for industry, but also being symbolizing fascism and neo-fascism. That symbol became used by actual neo-Nazi groups in society afterwards, who saw the ideas that were being displayed there as valuable, desirable, and good. By the way, just as a side note, while I'm here, a lot of the stuff I've talked about here in terms of film comes from the YouTube channel Folding Ideas. A lot of his older videos are about film theory, because he worked on film sets quite frequently. And this is something that's taken straight from his video on The Wall. That's a channel that I think is very useful to think about if you're thinking about art. A lot of pretty short videos and different film effects in particular, which I think are really useful. And a lot of what I'm taking from symbolism and metaphor, I'm taking from him pretty directly. So that's one thing. A symbol can become ambiguous. It can become, as a consequence, imprecise, and in some senses disempowered and defanged as a result of that lack of precision. However, a well-employed symbol or metaphor can make something more precise, because it's easy to say, and the example I have here, you could write about poetry and you could write about how poetry is fun to write, but whether a film contrasts that with a birthday party or an act of violence really changes how you come to understand the act of writing poetry. If you're contrasting it between those two things, if it's one shot writer at home writing poetry, next shot boxer in a ring celebrating after they've knocked out somebody, or if it's one shot writer is writing poetry in their room, next shot kids playing at a birthday party. One is about the overcoming, and one is about, like the boxing one would feel like it's saying that you're tussling with the artwork, you're trying to overcome it, and you're trying to overpower it, and it requires a raw strength, and there's a kind of almost perversity to the value you derive from it. It feels kind of almost wrong in a way, but feels valuable. The other is it's expression, it's communication, it's an unalloyed good, it's brilliant. And again, this doesn't require an unpackaged interpretation in order to elucidate. This is something that can be achieved just through feelings and sensations, and this is what the name of this effect is called. It can be achieved through juxtaposition in general, through comparison, through contrast, and it can be achieved through things like montage as well. So there's a lot of different ways in which symbolism can be used and altered, and it's important if you're discussing symbolism and metaphor, if you're discussing abstraction in debates, to be thinking in these terms, not whether metaphor is intrinsically one way or another, but how it is particularly deployed, or how it could be particularly deployed positively or negatively. Briefly here, I just want to talk about low art and false consciousness. So one thing that you'll oftentimes come into in debates is both positively and negatively, is the idea of like low art that is, and I'm using that's a pretty pejorative term. I'm using it here because that's the kind of term that people will use to describe it. Marvel movies, songs on the radio, etc., that are seen as in some way not of the same stuff that valuable art is. One thing that Adorno writes about, and I quite like Adorno, is what he calls the fetish character of art consumption, which is instead of actually engaging with the work in real terms, you engage with it very, very superficially, because you recognize things that it has that you recognize as well, and you substitute that for an actual engagement with the piece. A good example of this could be art that is overly nostalgic. If you're watching a movie set in, I don't know, the 90s, it's very different whether the movie is like, do you remember VHS tapes? Or whether they are talking about, whether they in more real terms discuss the kind of artwork or the world of the time. And it's easy to imagine how you can watch something and go, oh, I remember VHS tapes. And well, I don't, but you can imagine how someone would. Not because I'm great, by the way, just because I don't remember VHS tapes. You can imagine how someone would get into that sensation, and how that can eschew or override or undermine a more authentic or heartfelt engagement with the artwork. And what's also worth thinking about here, by the way, is how this is oftentimes going to be on the part of the audience rather than the artwork itself. It's not necessarily that the author chooses to engage with low art per se, but how the kinds of interpretations, understandings, or engagement with people can have with it can be of that kind of form. Similarly, I mentioned this previously, Roland Barthes distinguishes between pleasure and jouissance. Jouissance is like kind of like an elevated kind of experience of joy and pleasure as a result, not pleasure, but joy as a result of the text, whereas pleasure is this kind of like lower thing. So this is evocative. It's meant to be evocative. It's meant to provoke. This is something that you're probably going to have very strong feelings about one way or another. And it's also something you're going to have to deal with in debates along both lines. The two key questions you should be thinking about here at this stage is, can people be wrong about the art they like, or how can people be wrong about the art they like? And how can we distinguish art into high or low art, or can art be distinguished in those terms? So for the first question, I think a really strange kind of part of debates about art, which is that I guess actually debates in general, I think people kind of deploy proximity as an epistemological tool in ways that I find really, really unusual. Because people will say, a given person, insofar as they are the person who is closest to themselves, understands themselves better than anybody else. Therefore, the actions that they choose, you might say, as a result of their, of the free operation of their human will, are that which is in their interest, or that which takes into account their self better than anything else, or better than anyone else would. I think this is unintuitive and unmotivated. I think there's a variety of ways, a litany of ways in which people come to misunderstand themselves. Um, uh, and the two things I have at the bottom here. There's a lot of ways in which people are either alienated from their own preferences, struggle to form preferences, struggle to understand themselves, are too close to see, the forest for the trees. I think there's so many ways in which it's, people are operating under not their own preferences, but the deferred preferences of what society expects from them. People oftentimes, when they choose what music to listen to, what films to watch, etc., are not thinking about, and myself as well, everybody is like this. They're very rarely thinking like, what movies do I think Dylan, would like more than any other movie? They're thinking, what movies are people talking about that are good? I saw on Twitter people talking about this. I'm going to watch it. People have been talking a lot about Severance. I'm going to watch it. I have started watching Severance, by the way. It's really good. Uh, Similarly, people often take actions which they know are against their own preferences or which don't take into account their preferences. I know that my favorite movie is 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's a fantastic movie. It's brilliant. I do not watch it very often. And the reason is, it's just, even though I think I would enjoy it, it's much easier to spend 3 hours playing video games on your day off from work than it is to sit down and put on a movie, especially a really engaging and intense movie that you really like. Even if it is absolutely true that I would enjoy the experience of watching the movie more than I would enjoy the other experience, because watching art or consuming art requires something from you as the audience. It requires emotional honesty. It requires engagement and attention. It requires a kind of labor that is not always easy to inspire within yourself, to draw out from yourself, especially if you are tired, especially if you've got other things to think about, if you're distracted. It's just not easy to get into those headspaces extremely often. That being said, so this is all to say, if you are in an art debate and you're arguing against the general preferences of society, you have to think about how people formulate their preferences or understand themselves, either poorly understanding themselves or not understanding the preferences that they actually have, or when they take actions that are against those preferences or which do not take into account those preferences, and how that can be wrong for them in their lives. How they might require, this would be another easy example of it, is that like a lot of people might enjoy things that are novel and new and not experienced before, and they by definition therefore could not have a preference for it because they do not know what it is yet. And so if you have lacked the experience of something, either because it's new in like just actually new and novel, or because it's new to you, you can lack a preference with regards to it. Therefore be required to go against your preferences in order to find the thing that will be more valuable to you. So yeah, on the other hand, it's pretty dubious, right? The categorization of art into high and low art is descriptively, I think, in society, really poorly executed. In the most generous terms, it is really dubious. And if you're being ungenerous, you might want to think about all of the facets of society which go into categorizing art as high or low art, that do not take into account the quality of the artwork itself, but rather the ascriptive descriptions of the artists or the work that's being depicted or the historicity of that artwork. Which is to say, I think that this label can be deployed in ways that are generally pretty misogynistic, pretty racist, etc. As well as that, there is a lot of value that can be derived from art that is familiar, that is not pushing boundaries, or that a person has seen a bunch of times before or experienced a bunch of times before. 3 things that come to mind here. One is people can, communities can form around art that gets a much more deeper understanding of it than that which would happen if they were engaging with a different kind of art or different kinds of art very frequently. If you look at, for example, Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is a very, very, very good book, and it's got 3 very, very, very good movies as well. And perhaps it's true that someone, when I'm often when I'm feeling unwell, or even if I have a really bad hangover, I love going back to watch Fellowship of the Ring again. It's a fantastic movie. Am I getting anything artistically valuable and aesthetically valuable out of that experience? I think so, because you probably are picking up on things you didn't see previously, or you never step in the same river twice, right? Like, even if the artwork is the same, you've changed since the last time you've watched it, and that contrast, it can act as a kind of funhouse mirror for you in your life, right? Because you're using it as a mirror to look back on a previous version of yourself that understood it differently, because it evokes sensations that are new to you now, but it also evokes the prior sensations that you felt before. And that contrastive space between you now and you then, or even a you that's experienced continuously, is something that can really enlighten your understanding of an artwork, or enlighten your understanding of yourself. At the same time, communities around art can find a lot of value and interest in specific details you might not parse out otherwise. Even alongside this, right, like, there is a lot of interesting artistic merit and a lot of interesting artistic ideas being expressed, and aesthetic choices, even in the most common of music, the most common of art and film and literature, that communities will oftentimes discuss, and we'll get really into depths on the technique of that kind of thing. So it is really interesting to think about there. And the second thing is, you might want to think about the conditions under which people can come to value high art, and how frequently people are or are not alienated from them. So if you do want to have a very traditional understanding of high art, that there is some kinds of art, either particular media or particular pieces, authors, workers, which are of higher order value, you might want to think about how easy it is for people to get involved in that kind of thing, whether those spaces will be hostile to them, whether it will be easy for them to access them, whether it requires a degree of understanding to experience. Now, it's intuitive to say that these spaces are really, really inaccessible, but that's something you can certainly argue against as well, and something that I think it's really worth thinking about. It's like, it's easy to say that the art world is oftentimes elitist and that kind of thing. That's true sometimes in some spaces, but I don't know. I think if you walk around most galleries and museums, most of the people in there are pretty normal people that just think it's a little bit interesting and want to see cool stuff and want to see interesting stuff. You need to understand that people in the world are inquisitive and have ideas and can consider things and understand things. And even if they might think about things differently from you, that doesn't mean they're not having a really complex experience when engaging with a piece of art. So that's something that is worth thinking about there as well. And then finally, you might want to think about the ways in which low art shares features with high art for a particular person, right? Someone who understands pop music on a very deep level will be able to draw out details that other people won't. One thing I think is important to note here is that it's easy to think of art as being something whereby everybody experiences something identical. The text itself, the movie, the film, the painting, the song, is the same literal experience and gets changed at the level of interpretation. But I actually think that's broadly untrue. And this is something that you'll note if you have over time become more understanding of a particular medium, or even of a song. If you listen to a song 100 times, the 100th time literally feels different. It's literally being heard differently because you're parsing out details you didn't previously. It's the very same thing as if you look at photos taken of the night sky. If you take the same photo of the night sky over and over and over and over, if you have a very long exposure, you will see things that were not there previously. There will be new stars on the photographs that were not there at the start. That's, I think, to me, much more analogous to what it means to either become very, very familiar with one thing, or to become very familiar with one medium, so that these things become cross-applicable. Which is to say, somebody who's really, really, really well versed in jazz, intuitively, if they listen to jazz piece with someone who's really, really into classical music instead will be able to parse out things and hear things differently than each other. So that's something that's worth thinking about. If you do think that art requires a transformative, or requires a complexity in order to achieve a transformative effect, the conditions under which that complexity and that intention are ascertained when they come about in different spaces, or when people become alienated from them, either from alienation from themselves or alienation from the communities or environments in which that art could be perceived, are critical to think about in debates. Next thing is just an idea of negation. Adorno expresses this in the book Aesthetic Theory, but it's also, I think, something that is pretty common parlance in terms of art, which is that art has to negate its consumer in order to have a transformative effect on the consumer. Which is to say, people need to be challenged by art in order for art to change them. And I'm using the word transformative here intentionally because this is, I think, this argument is the strongest in instances of actual transformation, because just on an ontological level, on like a very literal, even just like a logical level, if something is not different from me and I receive it, I've not changed. You know, if you have a soup and you pour in more of the same soup into it, the content of the soup hasn't changed. It's not become different. So it hasn't negated it. It hasn't done something that is oppositional to it. It's just the same positive thing within it. And as we discussed previously, there's ways in which that can be still valuable, because if you come home from a tough day's work and you watch a TV show that you really like for the 100th time, that can be something which can be powerful in its own right, insofar as it can be distraction or escape or comfort, but it doesn't change you. Now, not to extend the soup analogy too much more, it might insulate you against change in a way that might be interesting, because the more soup you have, right, the less that someone adding some salt or pepper will change the overall flavor. Similarly, you might think of engaging with familiar art as something that can reinforce you and can kind of prevent you from being shorn away by the kind of society that you live in. But at the same time, it doesn't change you. And we oftentimes think that art requires that it changes you in some way. Either it changes your beliefs about the world, or even it changes your character or your understanding of the world. I think that's something that's very, very, it's a way in which art can be good, or bad, of course, but it's one way that art can operate. But there's four things that I think are worth thinking about as well, within these lines of challenging artworks, art that can, do something differently, right? Because if you add, leek and potato to your soup, it becomes a leek and potato soup, right? Or if it's too bitter and you add some salt, it doesn't become salty. It just gets rid of the bitterness, right? Because those two things counteract. So first thing is, you have to consider when challenging art becomes its own fetishized object. And what I mean by that is, I think people frequently who are interested in the idea of being challenged by art, or who are interested in the idea of difficult experimental or avant-garde pieces, may see the experimental nature of it, or the challenging nature of it, and think, oh, this is challenging. They recognize a superficial element of the work and substitute that for an authentic engagement with the content of the work. This is something we talked about previously in this workshop. And that is something that I think is really important, because as an audience, and it's important, when you're thinking about audiences, it's important to not neglect your own lack of innocence, right? Like, that's something that's very easy to fall into the trap of, right? In both ways. It's very easy to think, to see something that is experimental or avant-garde and think that's pretentious, I'm not going to engage with it. Or it's easy to see it and think that's amazing because it's unusual, rather than amazing because the unusuality has allowed the art to do something that it would not have been able to do otherwise, or that it allows it to do something that it can do differently from other artworks. So that's one thing that I think really worth thinking about. Second thing is thinking about when accessible art can have personal or communal value. There can be value to, as I said previously, listening to a song on the bus in the morning that's familiar, that gets you kind of motivated for the day, because it's energetic and it's fun and you're familiar with it, and so it kind of wakes you up a little bit. That doesn't require challenging, that doesn't require difficulty. And here you can maybe even argue that it is a kind of transformation. It doesn't change you into a different person, but it alters you into a different version of you that's more alert, awake, enthusiastic. Or communal value. And I think the easy example here is like, if you're on a dance floor, you kind of want, if you're going to have songs with lyrics in them, you want people to know what the lyrics of the songs are, or at the very least, that's a kind of experience that is really valuable. Everybody singing the one song together, everyone at a football game knowing the same chants, everyone at the party watching the same comedy that they really enjoy and everyone likes, because it can be instrumental towards other things in society that the artwork itself doesn't require. So it can be a catalyst for, and those experiences I think can be transformative, and this can catalyze those transformative experiences, even if it doesn't produce them in its own right. And so it's worth thinking about where this art is being deployed in this context of challenging this sort of negation. Similarly, it's worth considering the multiplicity of art, insofar as different elements of the art might negate or challenge, different parts might be familiar and affirm, and there's a bit of almost co-authorship between you and the artwork in that instance, where there's a bit of a push and pull. There's a bit of a negotiation that happens with the artwork, and you might want to think about whether the ideas that intuitively flow from this that you can use as arguments is like, does it require a balance in order for it to become more accessible for people to engage with, or does the familiar elements create an over-reliance on those familiar elements and allow you to eschew the challenging elements, whereas the challenging elements on their own would force you to reckon with them and can produce the challenging, the transformative effect that you would desire from it. How does an artist choose to do this, and does it work better or worse to choose different elements of your artwork to negate or affirm, right? What does it mean to have a challenging method of displaying an artwork if the artwork itself is very easy, right? So if you're doing graffiti on a public monument, but the graffiti is very familiar, something that people easily understand, versus the alternative, right? Having a really, really unusual piece of art that's very challenging being present in a gallery. Those are different methods of negotiating that push and pull between negation and affirmation, or negation and positivity, that could elicit a different effect. And so when you're thinking about art in debates, especially if you are talking about contrastive artworks, it's worth thinking about not just the kind of overall idea, art must challenge you in order to create a transformation, but rather the underlying ideas. Under what conditions does that happen? What is the effect that is produced by the different kinds of those conditions that happen? And how does that negotiation process play into the other elements of the artwork? And how can that be manipulated by the author or understood by the audience? And indeed, is it always required of an artwork that it does this? Or can art have value that is indeed still transformative, or maybe it's not transformative, but is in another way equally valuable, without requiring that challengingness? Fourth thing, just really briefly, but I think is a useful thing to note about, is that this is a process that happens within the author, within the creator of the artwork, because they have a push and pull within them between the ideas that they want to elicit, the ideas they want to espouse, what they find valuable, interesting, good, the traditions of the genre, and what that allows and permits, how your drums should sound in a particular genre of music, what your lyrics should be like, or even how long should your book be within a genre of literature. And alongside that, and related to that, of course, the audience's expectations, what you think they'll like to hear, what you think people will enjoy. And that, of course, is a process that is difficult, when it is a difficulty that overhangs the act of composition, because it is very difficult to choose to do something that is challenging, or that is authentically challenging, that is really, really, different and tough, because you know that it's not what people are expecting or what they per se want. And that's something that plays into what's very difficult, which is like people want to be recognized as being good and interesting and valuable. And so that's tough to negotiate on behalf of the artist. And you want to think about under what conditions can that artist, can that author feel liberated in making those choices. And indeed, the extent to which they should feel liberated in making those choices. What kind of, I guess, regulation from society, what temperament of the art do we require or do we desire within an artwork, or even what does an artist making art in a vacuum look like, right? Because I think it's probably true that people, when they're making art, even for no one to ever see, right? If you write a poem that no one ever looks at, that is not necessarily the case that you're immune, therefore, to the substitutions, or not substitutions, to the like regulations of the genre or of an audience, even when no such audience would ever actually exist. So that's an interesting kind of space to explore as well, which is like the cognitive space of the author when creating an artwork, and how that relates to the act of challenging. Not just what does it mean to be challenged by art, but what does it mean, or what does it mean to challenge people with your art, and how does that feel? How under what conditions does that happen? When is it good or bad? Okay. Another brief thing, but this is, I think, a useful thing, fourth element to add to that kind of picture that I was painting previously, which is that Adorno, and I think others as well, believe that there is kind of some sort of intrinsic telos or story or way in which an artwork should communicate its ideas. If you are making a song that is about this, about this sensation, feeling, or story, then each choice you make when making the artwork can be, in a sense, true or false. I think at this level, that's pretty intuitively true, to be honest, right? Like, it's really easy to think that like but choices that artists have made that you didn't feel were really true to the story that they were telling, but rather were motivated by something else. So that seems pretty fair. As something to talk about, right? Like a movie that you thought had a bad ending is a great example of this, right? Where it's like you don't think that fit with the story that they were telling. It was, in a sense, false. It didn't fit the kind of the schema, and he called it a schema in his writing. And a couple of things you want to think about here. So this is kind of like a Platonic kind of idea. Like there's a Platonic ideal of the artwork that to which the objective of an artwork is to relate, is to try to get as close to possible to as possible to, and that he therefore thinks this is undermined by overly traditionalistic, overly genre focused art. Now, a few different things you might want to think about here. One, is this true? Like that's, I think, a very intuitive idea for me at least, but relies on some kind of really kind of outmoded philosophy to work with, right? It requires a kind of Platonic system of ontology or of aesthetics, I guess, in order for that to be kind of even operable in the first place. So that's interesting, right? Like a really intuitive idea that requires something really weird to exist. Second thing is whether that schema is singular or multiply realizable, right? Is there one way to tell this story that every artwork that's trying to tell a story is working towards, that everyone is, chipping away at the statue of that feeling? Or is it multiply realizable? Is it that there's 20 paths that the author can take from this point in their work, and 6 of them feel kind of true to the story, and within those 6 they can navigate as they desire, or how they feel is most real to them? So that's something that's worth thinking about. Thirdly, is under what conditions can an author come to realize this? This is inspiration, right? This is there's I think a feeling that artists feel sometimes they talk about it a lot in interviews. You can experience it yourself if you ever write, if you ever make any art. It's also a lot of the focus of art. Sometimes there's a feeling that you get where like you get a glimpse of like something really really real and something really really true, and it's almost like the art has to be that thing, that idea, the thing is like that's absolutely right. You get a moment of like lucidity when you're perceiving a story or an emotion. You get a glimpse at it, and I think that's again pretty intuitive, very very common understanding of art, but something that we don't discuss I think a lot in BP debates is like when, and again remember we're talking about BP debates here, this is an extremely impactful argument if you can explain that your side of the house allows authors to feel this feeling more often or allows them to communicate it more easily in their art. And you might want to think about when that happens to them, right? And so maybe it's maybe it's when they're well fed and well paid for their work, right? Maybe it's when they feel more liberated to express those ideas, that kind of thing. And fourthly, finally, just like, is there a valued tradition that this goes against, right? What's the value of working within a traditional framework that this would have to go against? Because if there's an intrinsic value to the art itself or an intrinsic way that art should be, that is necessarily going to chafe against the expectations of the tradition that art is presented in. Or if not necessarily, certainly frequently, it will come up against those expectations. And those expectations may even indeed frequently override that option of having a more truer form of the art. So if you need to compare to this kind of argument, it's worth thinking about work within a tradition and how that works better. And I think there's some value to that. Tradition can become very, 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 very good at doing a certain kinds of things, right? And so that might mean that there is a kind of story or a kind of emotion or category of emotions and stories that it becomes really well equipped to describe, to create, and to express or depict. That is a trade-off, right? The universality of possibilities of experiencing and depicting emotions in an artwork or emotions, experiences, stories, whatever, versus the intensity of possibility, or not intensity of possibility, the intensity of those experiences when they're being expressed. Do you have the tools to do what you need to do in a couple of things? Is it better to be able to depict 3 things really, really well, or everything in a kind of all right way? Now, you don't need to think that's the trade-off there, and I don't think that's the trade-off there. But that's the kind of thoughts you want to be having there, which is like, if we do go with Adorno on this and we totally get rid of genre and tradition, what do we lose? And that's what you want to be thinking about if you find yourself arguing in favor of that kind of position. Okay, next thing is just a brief thing. I talked about this a little bit earlier, technical reproducibility. Just one thing I want to note here is just basically thinking about the ways in which art becomes reproduced and the texture of that art as it becomes reproduced. Because there's a very different thing between like reprintings of books versus listening to songs with headphones on, how we've moved from DVDs to Blu-ray to streaming, and how art is understood in those environments. But I'm not going to dwell on it too much longer because we've spoken about this already a little bit before. Briefly, just here, not going to spend too much time on this as well, because all of what we've talked about so far should be instrumental in discussions of AI art, but AI art becomes a subject of much debate here as well. So you probably got a lot at this stage of tools to talk about why AI art is bad. But there's a couple of additional things worth thinking about. Briefly as well, the ways in which AI art steals from artists, right? Oftentimes without strong legal justification, and the way it arguably supports a regrettable industry are all relevant in consideration of AI art here. And when I say descriptively it steals from art, what I mean by that is it collates a bunch of different pieces of art, of artworks, and produces based on that collation an artwork that literally includes that in its composition by definition. A couple of things that are worth thinking about though, if you need to defend AI art. One is there a real distinction between the kind of stealing that happens um, uh, in AI art versus the idea of inspiration? And this is, I think, a useful launching point to talk about very briefly. Copyright and art ownership. If you are talking about copyright and art ownership, you want to have a very robust understanding of where you think someone comes to own something. You're going to want strong intuition pumps here and examples. You're going to want a real philosophical reason, because ownership in art is very, very interesting, because the experiences that cause somebody to make a piece of art are at once unique to them and universal. Unique to them insofar as that combination of events that cause them to feel the kind of sadness that they are producing that they're reproducing and depicting in their novel, for example, is specific to them. But sadness is a universal human emotion, and that dialectic, even that contrast, is one that is, of course, key purpose of the work itself, right? Because when you're reading a work of art which depicts, as I spoke earlier, sadness that is specific to a particular experience, but relatable to your experience and somehow reaching at the universal experience of that emotion, that's the space in which a lot of artistic experience and value can be derived. So at once, it requires that it be unique, and it requires that it be universal, or at least you can certainly make that argument. Which means that at once the intuitive ownership is universal and singular. A few different ways you can work with that in terms of ownership. One is you can be very, very utilitarian and descriptive. You can just say, look, the conditions under which most people's lives is most better is the ones under which copyright protections are like this. And that can be either in favor of artists because it gives them security in their artwork, it prevents them from going into poverty and makes more people encouraged to be artists, etc. Or it can be on behalf of audiences if you prefer. The second thing is you might want to talk about labor and the work that goes into producing a piece of art, and how labor generally, we think, outside of some instances, gives a sense of ownership over something. If there is, if I go to the beach, I take some sand. That sand wasn't owned by anybody. But if I go home and I make that sand into a really, really ornate sculpture, and then someone comes into my home, and steals that sculpture from me, we would generally say that that's an act of theft. So if that is an act of theft, somewhere along that process of altering and tempering that sand, it's become my property. Or I have generated a right of ownership over it. So that is an act of labor. And I think similarly, outside of just the physical labor of it, we also think of mental toil and of emotional relationship with an artwork as generating a sense of ownership over it. This is a more difficult one to argue for, because the audiences will also have a strong sensation of ownership, a strong sensation about an artwork as well. So if you think that sorry, I've been talking for a long time, so my voice is kind of going. If you think that having a intense emotional relationship with something generates a special relationship with that thing, that can be the basis of an argument of ownership. The fact that an author has often labored over intensively a piece of work, outside of just the physical effort they're putting in, the mental effort and the kind of unique understanding and relationship they have with that work is oftentimes the can be a justification for them generating ownership over it. Alongside that, I think we tend to believe, or at least I would tend to believe, that people have a kind of a right over their own experiences. Like, it's a bit strange to say, because someone can't come and take your emotions from you, right? They can't take your sadness and put it in their brain. But we do tend to think that people kind of have a right over their own lives and experiences. It's why we think people should be allowed to write about things that happen to them in their own lives. Why we think it's fine for people to talk about, even often as pretty personal and intimate things, is that, well, that's their experiences and that's their right. So that's maybe where you could posit a distinction between the ownership of AI art and the ownership of real art, where I say real art, of non-AI art, where even if non-AI art draws inspiration from other artworks, and even if non-AI art may indeed use some of the other content of people's artwork, if you look at sampling and things like that, it's easier to generate a justification for ownership in the case of non-AI art than it would be for AI art. So that's, I guess, worth thinking about there. By the way, you can still be really, really radical about your understanding of ownership if you want here. Like, I think you can actually just suggest that no one should own any art. I think there's really what I've just said there should hopefully have already equipped you with the tools to think about why you might think that's the case. But one thing that's also worth thinking about is that you might want to draw a categorical material distinction between art and other kinds of ownerships, right? It means something different to own a bike than own a song. Second thing is, are there individual or categorical instances where AI art is inarguably valid and viable, and can those things be codified? So this is the kind of thing you might want to think about is if you're defending AI art and you have the possibility of counterprop fiat, you might want to cloister, a sideline, or siphon somehow AI art into a couple of categorical uses. You want to ring fence AI art into a couple of valuable uses, and there is some value here. Like, I think I remember I got a mod for a video game recently, a really, really old video game, Morrowind from like 2002 or whatever, that used not AI, I guess, but it used machine learning to enhance the textures, right? Because it's a really old game, so the textures are really low quality, and it just upscaled them via machine learning. Now, that's the kind of thing where, like, that could never have happened otherwise, right? Because no individual person can go through individually each texture and each model to upscale themselves. It could take a huge amount of time and effort, and the company's not going to go back and do it because it's a really old game that people don't really play anymore. And so there's instances where the demand or the desire for a particular kind of art exists, but where the supply cannot be produced, either because the demand is, even if very intense or even if very strongly felt by people who are either low in number or who don't have the money to spend on it, or because the labor required to make it would be so massive and intense that it could not be justified by any kind of demand. Similarly, I think, so that's that kind of thing. Although, of course, on the other hand, you have to remember, like, one of the strongest arguments against AI art is that it does take away jobs for artists in an instance where, a world where jobs for artists are pretty scarce already, and so it can be difficult to do that. Thirdly, is there any possible artistic merit that AI art can generate in its role as AI art? And one thing that I think people argue sometimes, and I don't find it super intuitive, is like, because there's no actual real human who has made it, there's no actual authorship, the piece is somehow fake as a consequence of that. I think this is like, I guess I never found that to be super intuitive. That there needs to be a real connection with another human in order for an artwork to be valuable. And the reason I don't find it extremely intuitive is because a lot of the experiences of art that I've had in real life were of things that were just non-authored, right? They're just like happenstantial, vistas. You catch the light out your window as it reflects on a street sign in a particular way that you just find really striking, that didn't require a human connection to brought about. And I think there's interesting stuff you can think about on the other end here. So the image I have in the background here is from an AI generated version of Seinfeld called Nothing Forever that was running on Twitch for a while. It got taken down because AI generated Seinfeld was seen as making a transphobic joke. And the really fascinating thing is, when I heard this, I thought, that's crazy. Went and watched it. And I actually don't think that joke was transphobic. I think maybe it's poking fun uh, at the ways in which comedians you know manipulate culture war issues for their own ends. I recommend going and watching it, forming an opinion for yourself. But the fascinating thing about that is that, like, it doesn't actually mean anything for it to be transphobic or not, because there's no intention to the artwork. It wasn't made with a particular person who wanted to evoke a particular effect as a result of the joke. So it's like it's like death of the author on steroids, right? Like I think that is, like, in a way, also kind of fascinating to talk about. It's really, really interesting. And so you might want to think about, like, how AI art and death of the author relate to one another in a really, really interesting way that might be good or might be bad, to be clear. Because I think one thing you could certainly argue is that it allows for the evasion of accountability, where that accountability would otherwise be brought about. So yeah, that's one thing that's worth thinking about. Similarly, other isolated or judicious uses of AI art that might be valuable. You know, somebody that's I don't know, someone that's like wants to make a video game, and they don't have a musical ear at all, but they have a really specific idea of the music that they want for it, and so they pop it into an AI art generator, and they make the music for it, and they sell the game to 30 people for $1 each, and they feel great about it. Like, maybe that is, you could say, like, no, that's still wrong. They should have paid somebody on Fiverr to do it, or they should have learned how to do it themselves. There's also, of course, obviously instances where the option of that wouldn't have been available to people. There is a difficult and kind of murky discussion around how the use of generative AI and of large language models, but also like AI kind of more broadly, or sorry, more specifically, relates to disability. And I think that I'll allow you to form your own opinions and thoughts about it. The general discussion would be whether people for whom the creation of a particular piece of art would be very difficult or impossible without the use of technology should be required to not use that technology because of the negative effects that it has on society to use that technology. Again, whether that's a true statement, which is to say, whether it is true that exists, that there is really, for some people, no alternative but to use AI art. That's something you can form your own opinions about. But it is something you might want to be thinking about when you're thinking about AI art, which is like, it's not just in instances of disability, but like, for whom can AI art be valuable, and will it be valuable for them, or will it be harmful for them? So that's something that's worth thinking about there. Okay, I'm gonna move on to some general tips and tricks, but first I'm just gonna pause this for a second so I can grab some water, because my throat is going a little bit. All right, so that's most of what I have to say about art and talking about arts and debates. Basically, what I'm going to do now is, because I understand that a lot of what we've talked about so far is, firstly, evocative, in the sense that it's trying to generate in you ideas and to get you to think about what your own thoughts are on art, and kind of come up with your own ideas and understandings. But also, secondly, it's been, I guess, only overlapping with BP debating rather than very specific, in terms of like on the ground in actual debates, what do you do? And so I want to focus on a couple of different things now that I think can be useful to remember in debates about art themselves, and actual debates that you'll be doing that center around art discussion. One thing I will say, just as an overview here, is the first thing I think it's really, really important to do. This is in all kind of genre debates, any art debates, narrative debates, philosophy debates, etc., economics debates, so on. Like any debate that's about a particular topic, or that seems to be about a particular topic. The very first thing you want to do is think about whether you really think it is of that topic. Because often a debate which seems to be an art debate will center around ideas that are broadly unrelated to art. And so what you want to do is firstly be considering whether this debate is going to be focused on art, the art world, the artist, the audience, or whether it's going to be focused on something else. And alongside that, if you do, regardless, choose to make an argument that does center around the artwork, the art world, the artist, and the audience, you're going to need to figure out how you're going to weigh against or impact against or analyze against those other things that people will be talking about in the debate. So that's the kind of the first kind of piece of advice that I would give about these kinds of debates, which is like know when something is an art debate as such, or whether it's like going to be like most debates, something that features a variety of different topics that people will be exploring, one of which will be art. Even if maybe the primary one is art, it may feature a number of other things as well. But moving on then. So first thing is weighing. One thing that you'll frequently have to do in art debates is weigh audiences or weigh artists. Why do we think that, if you're choosing like whether artists should do this or, this has prefers a world where art is like this, you might want to weigh up art versus audiences. And a lot of this stuff is going to be pretty intuitive. I mean, there's some things that are worth thinking about in specific terms that might be worth remembering because they might help tip the balance in this kind of way. First thing is, so obviously if you're weighing audiences, the intuitive manner of weighing you'll have available to you is scale, right? There are vastly more people who experience art than there are who produce art. One thing that you want to consider here as well is also how that number pretty much rounds to one, right? Like almost everybody is a part of an audience of art on a pretty regular basis, even if they're not interested in art. That's obviously not always going to be true because you might not always be talking about all art. You might be talking about some specific art. So it's worth categorizing the scale here as well. But what I think is really, really, really useful is when you're doing that, making sure that you're not avoiding talking about the intensity of impact that happens towards some people on that scale. So I don't think it's necessarily true that the person who is most impacted by an artwork is the artist. I don't even think that's going to be generally true. I think often it's going to be, across the spectrum of people who experience an artwork, there will be some people for whom that artwork is an exceptionally intense experience, either positively or negatively. So thinking about that in real terms as well, right? Like, an artist might make 50 songs in their life. One of those songs that they might forget about and they couldn't tell you the lyrics 30 years later when they're asked, to play it at a gig. For someone else, that was their wedding song. And for someone else, they think they will not forget those lyrics until the day they die because they're etched onto their heart, right? For some people, that song was a song they listened to 40, 50 times a week when they're going through a tough period. And when it comes on the radio now, they cry. There will be people who have absolutely stupendous relationships with particular pieces of art. And you can, it's also not always going to be the biggest pieces of art. I'm sure if you think into your own life, the artwork that has been most important for you, or even just like, memories of artworks that were important to you, they might not necessarily be, the biggest, most popular pieces of art. They might not even necessarily be really good. They could just be things that are really particularly important to you. And so it's worth remembering that intensity of experience is something that is not just available for artists. Similarly, that people will oftentimes say when they're weighing up artists, as we'll get to in a second, they are in a pretty disprivileged position relative to the media, and especially less famous artists who oftentimes are struggling to make ends meet. It's not always true that that's going to be more the case for them than their audience. Plenty of people who are working class or otherwise marginalized in society find extreme value from particular pieces of art. So the first thing I guess I'm saying is like be understanding and aware of the ways in which you're going to get weighed against and preempt them when you're doing your weighing. Secondly, any impacts that require scale can only be achieved at the audience level, right? If you are arguing that you will lead to political or social change, that can only happen as a result of the audiences changing their perspective rather than artists changing their perspective. That's not necessarily a kind of weighing per se, because you're not going to be weighing comparatively here if that happens, right? You can't say we think the audiences are more valuable because the political change that we've impacted can only happen through audiences, right? Because opposition, if they're arguing for artists, won't be arguing about political change. So it will require some secondary weighing to explain why that political or social change was so important. That's a kind of impact that can only be available through audiences. Third thing is, in some cases, artists might have a revealed preference for the audience experience. This is difficult to argue, but it's certainly an interesting argument that you can make, which is like artists would prefer that the audiences have a better experience than that they have a better experience. Because they are oftentimes people who have sacrificed for their art. Now, that's not always going to be directly analogous because not all artists have sacrificed for their art. And also at the same time, the nature of the sacrifice or their preference might not be that the audiences had a better experience per se, but it could be that their work was more true to them, true to their vision and that kind of thing. Or maybe they just didn't think there was anything else they could do. Maybe they just wanted to do art because they really found it valuable and enjoyable. And so the sacrifice was so that they could achieve their own goals. But it's an interesting way to think about the relationship between, because you could go both ways on this, right? The relationship between the preferences that audiences and artists have for one another. Because maybe I would be happy, this is probably true, I would be happy if all my favorite musicians released albums 30% less frequently if it meant that working musicians had more security in their life. So that's something that's worth thinking about as well. Similarly, if you're going to be ending up weighing on quality of art here, you might want to think about how the audiences of today are the artists of the future. A kid that gets to listen to a really cool piece of art on Spotify, even if Spotify isn't good for artists in general, the fact that it opens up their world to a completely new way of thinking about music that they didn't have previously, and that even if 1 out of every 1,000 of those kids goes on to be a musician, and even if 1 out of every 1,000 of those kids goes on to be a good musician, that's an order of magnitude iterated across all music, of new great music that you wouldn't have had previously. People being able to achieve dreams they wouldn't have even been able to conceptualize previously. And so that's something you might think about as well, because you could also argue that it improves quality of art along similar lines. So that's something you might want to think about a little bit as well when you're weighing audiences. Like, on the long term, how does that impact the art that those audiences then go on to create? Or how does that impact how art is talked about in society in ways that make it more conducive for artists to come forward into the future? That's not necessarily weighing, that's, I guess, more impacting, but it's kind of in the middle area between the two, right? Where you're explaining that your argument is more important than the others because it benefits the artist in the long term as well. So that's, I guess, a couple of different ways you can think about weighing of audiences versus artists. On artists versus audiences, first is vulnerability and quality of life. I think this is the flip side of the previous argument, but I think it's certainly arguable that artists are offering a level of, very frequently at least, offering a level of emotional honesty and availability that is difficult to expect from them, that leaves them exposed, that leaves them kind of open in a way that's obviously very difficult to do. In some sense, you could therefore say we are required to respond with generosity in kind, because they've done something very kind and very generous for us in doing this. Even if it aligned with their interests, it required something difficult from them that deserves reward or compensation or that kind of thing. You can do that in terms of, as I've just expressed there, a kind of principled way, right? We owe an obligation back to artists. Or you can do it in terms of utility, right? The marginal decreasing utility, or marginal diminishing utility, is different for artists versus audiences. And for a lot of artists, it will massively increase their quality of life. A small increase in the quality of life can massively increase that quality of life. A small change can have a big impact for them. Secondly is authorship and ownership. Basically, the ideas that we discussed previously, there's strong arguments to suggest that authors should have a high degree of freedom over what they choose to express in their work, or even if not necessarily a high degree of freedom, when they have chosen to express it, they have a strong claim of ownership over it. And that maybe, for example, deserves compensation. I'm thinking about this also again in terms of like, arguments about whether streaming has been beneficial or harmful. Very common debate. The argument for proposition is that audiences will be benefited from having more music available to them. They can listen to things they wouldn't have had previously. The argument from the other side is that it's bad because there's poor compensation for the work of artists. If we do think that this work is of high value to society, that they have a fair claim of ownership over that, they probably do deserve compensation for it in ways that we think is probably, like it might be true that your experience going to McDonald's would be better if everything was cheaper and they were paying their workers less. But we tend to think that the compensation owed to the workers as a result of their labor is a higher priority than the quality of the experience of the audience or the customer. Or even if we think that they're of equal priority, like the actual experiences of equal priority, I would think that the moral obligation to discharge is with priority is the one to do with compensation. So it's you could think that both groups are equally morally salient and still think that the action that you should take is the one that is better for one group because the kind of moral action it is. It's an obligation, right? Third thing, scale and intensity. So I have this here kind of to suggest against some of the stuff we've established previously in the previous slide, because I think you can actually argue not that artists are larger in scale than audiences, but I think you can go against a little bit of the idea that people suggest that there's a vanishingly few number of artists, because I don't think that that's true. And there's kind of a gradient. It's not like emotion about dentists, right? Emotion about dentists is a very specific number of dentists in the world. If you have emotion about artists or in which artists are a group, that size of that group varies a lot depending on how you're discussing it. And maybe in the instance of streaming, the debate is only relevant for the category of musicians who have their music on streaming, which is probably not a huge amount. But at the same time, the percentage of people who at some point in their life have written a poem, have written a song, have painted a painting, made a drawing outside of school, for their own pleasure, for their own artistic fulfillment, I would say is very, 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 very high. And at what point of frequency of creating art somebody becomes an artist is kind of an open question. And that gives you room to navigate in a debate in either direction if you need to manipulate the scale or indeed the kind of argument that you're making. Because you could very easily make an argument in an art debate that's like, we're going to talk about a pretty large group of artists, which is the people who paint paintings that only their families see and that they put up on Instagram to 37 likes, but will never be in a gallery, will never have their name being remembered or written in textbooks. and we think that this is a huge, huge, huge amount of people. And I think you can make a lot of arguments as to why that would be a pretty substantial proportion of the population. Similarly, for musicians, a lot of people learn how to play a musical instrument. And honestly, whether they choose to retain that and explore that rather than forgetting about it is a place where you could talk about it a little bit in the debates. And this is where I'll mention something that I think is very, very, very important when thinking about art in debates. It's actually a really critical piece of advice. I should have probably put it closer towards the start of the workshop. I think it's very, very important to not think about art purely in terms of galleries and paintings. I think when you're talking about who's playing a gig in their local pub this evening, who's making posters to hang around on telephone poles, who's making signs for shops, who's putting out poetry to 100 likes on Instagram. That's pretty good numbers, to be fair. That I think makes it feel all the more real when you're talking about it, because suddenly you're not talking about strangers, you're talking about people that you know, people that perhaps even you are. And that level of connection and groundedness with the subject matter, I think, can oftentimes either enhance your presentation of your arguments because you'll feel it more authentically, or it can make your idea selection and case selection and generation become much more stronger and more nuanced because you're thinking more creatively, because you've got something really intuitive to work around for it. So with that in mind, I think that you can actually argue that it's a pretty sizable group, and you want to build up the size of that group if you are talking about artists as an impact in the debate, because the kind of looming specter of scale is going to be ever present when you're making those arguments, and you need to have an answer to it prepared if you're making an argument about artists. Similarly, the directionality thing happens here as well. Not only is it the case that a higher experience for audiences might enhance the quality of art in the future, but also you can argue, depending on the motion, that the quality of life or quality of or the freedom provided to artists enhances the quality of the art as well, and therefore the audience's experience. That's something that gets ping-ponged around in debates a little bit. I would say if you are going to make that argument as a piece of weighing for why artists are valuable or as sort of impacting to kind of mitigate the other side, you want to dedicate a pretty decent amount of time to it. And you want to be discussing some of the stuff that we talked about previously, such as the conditions under which people are alienated from their preferences or express preferences that are not real or that are in some way false to the person who's expressing them. So it does require actually a little bit of work to achieve in a way that I think gets underdone, because if you just say, oh, well, when artists have better quality of life, they'll make better art, that I think tends to get forgotten by the time, not forgotten, but like that's not enough, there's not enough meat on the bone there for a judge to really take that seriously as a piece of weighing. For better or worse, maybe they should take it more seriously. But if you give it some level of detail, it can be more easy to achieve the effect that you desire from that piece of weighing. Impacting, similarly, it's important to not be euphemistic about your impacting. Be as specific as possible through the lenses that we talked about earlier. What I want to talk about as well is impacting your impacts. If you have gotten a strong definition of what it means to feel catharsis, and you've been very specific that what it means is it means that you are seeing your emotions that you thought were unintelligible, oceanic, and uninterpretable. You're seeing them being represented in a light that you've now find them to be not just understandable, but relatable, universal, and human. That's obviously an intense impact derived from a piece of art. And what you want to do, therefore, is impact that impact outwards onto the world. What does that mean? What does that make people do? What does that allow people to do? It makes people more willing to talk about others with their experiences because they no longer feel isolated in those experiences. They feel represented, they feel seen. It could be that it means that that person just generally feels the next time they feel that emotion, that they feel the wrongness of it less intensely because they now have the language of interpretation available to them, or they can understand those feelings differently than they did previously. So the next time they start feeling a sudden dread when they're walking in the street because they feel, I don't know, maybe they start feeling small, and that's a feeling that they have pretty frequently. They're more able to, instead of panicking and canceling the event they were going to and going home, they're more likely to be able to calm down and go into a coffee shop to sit down for a minute, relax, and then continue on to do whatever they were going to be doing previously. You want to be very literal and example heavy in these impacting, because a lot of this stuff can be unintuitive or can be a little bit abstract until you give it that kind of groundedness that gives it meaning, that gives it weight in the debate, that gives it, I guess, impact in the debate. So you want your impacts to be impactful, and since you want your impacts to be impactful, you want them to be grounded, you want them to be real, you want them to be non-euphemistic, especially because this is your opportunity to show when you're delivering your speech that you're not that you are in the real world, that you're not talking about something that is irrelevant to people's day-to-day lives, and you really want to avoid that, because oftentimes when you're in arguments about art, and you're making arguments that are about art rather than about something else, the charge you will be provided with by other teams, the accusation they will make of you, is that you are not talking about the real world, that you're not talking about something that is relevant and important to real people's lives, to average people's lives, and they'll talk about something else. They'll talk about economics. They'll talk about jobs for artists. They'll talk about that kind of thing. You need it to be available to you when you're delivering your speech, these real impacts, such that either you can deliver them as a POI when that response gets given, or that the other team feels unconfident delivering that POI now and needs to start engaging with the content of your speech in higher levels of detail than they were previously, because you've already insulated yourself against that first level of attack. You've made your arguments real in their composition and in their expression in the first place. So that's something that's, I think, really, really important to do. I also think it'll make it much easier for you to understand what you're going for. It can help tighten in the focus of your case a little bit once you understand what your impacts are going to be. And yeah, I just think it really enhances the speech. So I think this is where I would suggest that it's a time to get real. When you're delivering your speech, is at the level of impacting the impacts, is what I would say. Couple of common arguments to defeat. So these are, I think, are 4 of the most common arguments you'll see in debates about art. And they're something you're going to need to navigate when you're in an art debate. So if you are making an argument in an art debate, you need to be thinking about whether these 4 arguments are defeated by your argument. Firstly, more art, more good. People will say the quantity of art that is produced in society is the most important thing in the debate, because everyone in this debate agrees that art is good, and therefore more art is more good. This is very, 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 very common. And it's not the worst argument in the world. But hopefully at this stage, you will now already be equipped with the tools to think about 2 things. 1, instances where art is bad, harmful, wrong, evil, manipulative, and therefore why more art may not be more good. And secondly, the kinds of things that art can do, but doesn't always do, such that it's not scalar. It's not that a certain saturation of art in your life will allow you to have transformative experiences through art, or cathartic experiences through art, or intense emotional experiences with art, but rather, it's not that you watch, it's not fungible, I guess, is maybe the term, right? Like watching 15 Marvel movies isn't equal to watching Parasite once, and it's not that the exchange rate is different, right? It's that they're categorically different. They're different experiences. Art is not divisible in that kind of way. It's not that a certain thing has 270 art points, and then this thing has 160 art points. And so if you do the thing that has 160 art points twice, you'll have more art points in your experience. Art does things. It does things to people. It does things to people because of what the art does, because of the content of the art and how it's being expressed and how it's being experienced. So those are the once you have that in mind, once you're thinking about art in these terms, it should be obvious how this argument is a very defeatable argument, but it's something you need to be prepared for to defeat when you're providing your analysis. Secondly, we discussed this in great detail earlier. People like the art that they like, and so making it more available to them is good. Trying to get people to go against their preferences is bad. We've talked a lot about the ways in which people can form preferences that are obscured to them, or sorry, rather the way people can have preferences which are obscured to them, from which they are alienated. I've talked about the pros and cons of this already, but it's a particular argument that you'll need to be able to defeat, that you need to be prepared for. Third one, this is a very interesting one. Art which is open to interpretation is by nature more universal. This is, I think, a very, very common argument in debates about art, that the more open interpretation is, the better, because more people will be able to relate it to more of their life, and therefore it will be more intense. This is an interesting one because I think it's kind of true and kind of not true. I think this is an argument that can be made, to be clear, can be made very, very well. But I think that it's intuitively false at its extremes, right? Because I think it's intuitively true that the most open art possible, which is to say nothing, like a depiction of nothing, is not by definition or by nature more valuable than a specific piece of art. As we talked about a lot earlier, we talked about interpretation, we talked about contextual interpretation and feelings that happen as a result of experiencing art. Those feelings can be elicited by specificity of expression, by art technique. Similarly, a piece of art may begin to go against its ability to challenge you by being more open and universal, because the more interpretable something is, the less it is required of you that it challenge you. Thirdly, the more open to interpretation something is, it certainly can be argued that that might be against, if you believe Adorno and you think that art has a specific schema that it should follow, it might be likely or more likely to be going against that schema. And just the intuitive, I think, stuff here as well, right? Which is like, there is a cathartic value from artists to making art that represents their own experiences directly, or in a way that they saw as real to them, rather than which is the most objectively universal or more objectively interpretable. At the same time, however, I do think that there is some value to kind of openly interpretable art, and it does seem like a bit of a shame if an artwork that is where the art itself is very open to interpretation, but where one particular interpretation has taken root, one manner of interpreting or viewing or experiencing that artwork has become paramount. That does seem like a shame, I would say. So that's something that you need to be considering when you're thinking about art debates, because that's a very, very common argument to see. It can be done very, very well. And it's not immediately obvious why it would be false in a particular debate. So you do need to think about it a little bit when you're doing it. Fourthly, similarly, I guess, art should be accessible because access to art is good. Again, this is another one where a very, very common argument to make in art debates. And I think a pretty reasonable argument to make in art debates a lot of the time, right? Like, this oftentimes won't be the most interesting argument that a team runs in a room, but it can be really, really effective. And you have to remember that novelty doesn't score points in BP. And similarly, just to be very clear, like I'm not trying to downplay this argument. Like, I think that this argument can be made extremely compellingly in ways that are both novel and non-novel. So it's something you need to be aware of, because if you are adding conditionalities to art that excludes people from the experiences that you want to elicit by that art, you need to have a justification for that exclusion, especially if the other side is going to get more people involved in art, get more people involved in interesting art, get more people involved in art that's valuable to them, both in the act of consumption and in the act of production of art itself. So that's something you need to be absolutely aware of. Now, similarly to some of the things that we talked about previously here, one manner in which you can defeat this is just that access to art is not an a priori good. Access to art is a conditional good. Access to art is good when that art has value and when it is beneficial. Similarly, I think where this is often going to be fought, where this argument is often going to be fought, is on just on the grounds of accessibility on your side, right? Like if you're arguing about and the famous motion from I think Imperial recently, right? Painting A versus painting B, where painting A was I think it was Jackson Pollock painting, and painting B was a Da Vinci painting. It was the Last Supper. And a very intuitive argument you can make here is that the Last Supper is a better painting because it is more accessible. It is more easily interpretable without requiring an art degree to understand it. Here's where I think some of the tools that we've been talking about here would be quite useful, right? Because if you're thinking, Susan Sontag, you can actually think, well, to be honest, access to the Jackson Pollock painting is equally, if not more, universal, because the feeling that you feel when you watch that painting or when you look at that painting doesn't require, all it requires is an open mind and an open heart. It doesn't require an art degree. And so that's oftentimes the kind of ground you'll fight this argument on. You'll be thinking about what accessibility truly means and what you are trying to make more accessible versus making it inaccessible. Does accessibility extend to an understanding of the historicity of an art piece, being able to pluck out particular techniques, or is it just that you can feel truly about that art piece? Again, lots of ways you can maneuver this. The main thing I want to just suggest here is that this is an argument that you need to be aware of when you're doing art motions, because it's going to be one of the more common arguments you'll see in art motions. It can be done very, very well, it can be done poorly, but it's something you need to be prepared for. Framing. This is, I mostly included this just for the momentary visual comedy of the frame appearing on the screen. But I guess I'll just very, very briefly discuss it because to justify having the joke, which is obviously there's so many factors in society that influence the art world, and the art world is not it's not separated from society. Not really, at least it's embedded within it. It is both a consequence of it and it is a cause of it. And that's something that I think is going to be important to remember when you're especially when you're initially starting to try and make more arguments that are focused on the art itself, and that are focused on art in its own right, is to not end up isolated from the society in which that art exists. And this can be really beneficial. Rather, it can be beneficial for you making arguments, because thinking about the conditions in society that alter how art is created and consumed, how art is politicized or politically deployed, is going to be a very useful consideration for the debate, because it's going to provide an impactfulness to your arguments that abstracted ideas tend to not have unless they've been given the provision of that grounding in debate. And that's not a dishonest characterization of it, because I think that it does really enhance our understanding of art when we think of it not in terms of pure escape as something that is outside of society to which we retreat when society is too much, but when we think of it as an embedded part of the world we live in that does indeed operate sometimes as a form of escape, but can operate in a variety of different ways as well. And when we think of it as the powerful motivating force that it is in society, that it is not merely the act of going to a gallery for which a couple of people out of every couple of thousand find valuable, which not to say that that's not valuable in itself, but rather that it's something to which almost every single person finds an intense relationship with, at least at some point in their life. I think that can give your argument the gravity that it deserves when you're talking about art, but it also can provide it the direction necessary in the debate. So try to not get too abstracted. This is not to say that you should diminish the abstraction of your ideas, to be clear. It's fine to go very abstract when necessary. But what I'm trying to say is that you don't want to end up separated, cleaved from the society that you're describing, because ultimately these debates are taking place in the world, and I think you'll generally be benefited from remembering that when you're discussing your argument. So yeah, that's the main thing that I have to cover. I think apologies again for the duration of this. I know it's a very, very long workshop, but I had a lot to say, and I'm thank you if you did listen to this. Even if I would probably recommend, if I could go back to the start of this, I'd probably recommend listening to this episodically, rather than listening to it all the way through. But yeah, I guess again the general plea that I made at the beginning: set more art debates if you're someone who is in the position to do them. Set interesting and experimental art debates if you can. They're fascinating to talk about. I find them very interesting. I think a lot of people do as well. And finally, as well, like if you're in a debate about art, feel free to think outside the box. To think, about a lot of the different things we talked about here, but to formulate your own ideas as well, and to try those kinds of interesting choices that you might not make in a different debate, because it is often has a really cool space to explore those ideas, and that can be really valuable to talk about. So yeah, thanks very much for listening, and yeah, hope you have a nice day.